Hey guys, so in this video we'll talk about how to structure a persuasive essay, and more specifically we'll be focusing on the counter argument. So in a previous video I had gone over how to structure a general 5-paragraph essay, and a persuasive essay generally follows the same format. There are some slight differences, so I'm just going to review that. In your introduction, you should begin your introduction with an attention getter, of course, and then you're going to give some background information. So typically you're going to explain what the controversy is in this essay. If you are writing a persuasive essay, then obviously you're arguing for one side versus another, so there is some type of controversy there. So you're basically going to explain what that controversy is and give your reader whatever background information they need to know in order to understand your topic. Next, you're going to state your thesis, and this, of course, appears as the last 1 to 2 sentences of your introduction. And in your thesis, you're going to mention what your exact position is on this topic. So a lot of the times when we're writing a persuasive essay, students feel compelled to choose one side or the other, even though they may feel like they're somewhere in the middle. If you are in the middle of a topic, that's totally fine. You just need to be very specific about what it means to be in the middle in your position. Next, we're going to talk about our body paragraphs. So in your body paragraphs, you should ideally discuss 2 articles or more articles, how many ever you're writing about. You should discuss more than 1 articles in each one of your body paragraphs so that you're synthesizing your sources and so that your paper feels more connected. If you're if you are discussing 1 article for every body paragraph, then your paper is going to feel very disconnected, and people are going to forget, your readers are going to forget what they read about in the first paragraph if you're asking them to make those connections all the way down to like in a later paragraph. So it's very helpful for you and for your reader if you are talking about multiple articles in each one of your body paragraphs to synthesize your sources. Now, when you're structuring your body paragraph, of course, you are going to start that paragraph with a topic sentence which explains the main point of that paragraph. And then you're going to introduce your audience to your evidence. So basically explain what the context of the quote is, and we went over this more extensively in my video on essay formatting. After you introduce your evidence, you're going to give your evidence, so you're going to use signal phrases to introduce your quotes and give some type of context there. Then you're going to analyze your evidence, so what is your evidence showing, and how does this point support the point that you're making in this paragraph. And finally, you're going to discuss your point. So what is this, how does this paragraph support your overall argument? And you're going to transition to your next body paragraph. So the thing that's really different in this essay is you're going to include a counter argument. So your counter argument will follow the same structure that we just outlined in the previous paragraph. So you will have a topic sentence, you're going to introduce your audience to your evidence, and you're going to do all of that good stuff. But the point of a counter argument is to explain one strong point from the opposition and go on to explain why that point is not valid. So make sure you use evidence to support your critique of the opposition, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide. Please note that here I have said that you should choose one strong point from the opposition to address. You don't want to have a weak point from the opposition, even though it might be easier to argue against. You shouldn't have a weak point because that weakens your own argument. It shows that you didn't really deeply think about your topic, or you chose a weak point because you're not that confident in your ability to argue against the opposition. So choosing a strong point and countering that point shows that you're a confident writer and you know your information well enough to go against the opposition in a very strong way. And then, of course, you'll have your conclusion, which should briefly summarize your main points and do other things in your conclusion, which I talked about in the lecture on essay formatting. Now we're going to go over some steps that you should follow when you're creating your counter argument. What I'm about to go over is not steps to actually write the counter argument, it's just steps that you should go over to plan out your argument before you begin writing it. So first you want to refer to your thesis, and I'm going to use an example of physician-assisted suicide to help walk you through this counter-argument paragraph. So for a paper on physician-assisted suicide, I can argue that physician-assisted suicide should be legalized in all 50 states. Then I'm going to think about what's one strong point from the opposition. So I might say, someone may come and say to me, physician-assisted suicide should not be legalized because we can't be sure that patients are making this decision on their own. Family members or physicians may be pressuring them to choose this option when they really don't want to. Now this is a key element, and this is the step that a lot of students forget to do. You have to now go ahead and counter the opposition's point. So if you don't do this, then you're basically arguing for the opposition, which of course is going against your entire thesis. So you want to bring in your counter to the opposition to make sure you're still staying in line with your argument of your paper and with your thesis. So for example, remember the opposition's point that I mentioned was that family members may be pressuring people to choose this option. Now I'm going to say rigorous guidelines can be put in place to protect patients and ensure they're making this decision independently and that they are of sound mind. So that is basically explaining why why the opposition's point that people might be pressured to make this decision. That's explaining why that's not a valid enough point for someone to say that physician-assisted suicide should not be legalized. So in countering the opposition, I'm making sure that I'm arguing my thesis. Next, I'm going to create my topic sentence for my actual counter-argument paragraph. So I might say something like, while critics of physician-assisted suicide believe that patients may be coerced by family members or physicians to make that decision, there are guidelines in place to prevent this type of abuse. So that's the first sentence of my counter-argument paragraph. Now we're going to go ahead and actually write our counter-argument paragraph, so we'll go through the structure of it. You should, of course, start with your topic sentence, which states one strong objection the opposition would have against your argument, and your counter to that, and that should be roughly 1 to 2 sentences. And I previously wrote the topic sentence in the previous slide, so I'm basically going to state that exact topic sentence. By the way, PAS means physician-assisted suicide. Next, I'm going to introduce my audience to the evidence. So I'll say something like, one organization that illustrates this is the Death with Dignity National Center, which is a nonprofit organization that advocates for the legalization of physician-assisted suicide through education, information, support, and legal defenses. So what I'm doing here is I'm basically giving a little bit of context about where the quote appeared, and I'm also kind of explaining what makes the source credible so that my audience can then trust me as they're reading my paper. So now I'm going to give my evidence introduced with a signal phrase, and a signal phrase is basically a sentence or a short statement that introduces a quote, and it's indicating that you're about to give a quote. You don't want to give a quote by itself as a sentence because then it becomes a dropped quote, and that's not a good thing. So here I have my evidence introduced with my signal phrase is, they critique those who argue that terminally ill patients are at risk for coercion from family members and physicians, as, quote, peer-reviewed research has found no evidence whatsoever of heightened risk to or, in fact, any instances of abuse of particularly vulnerable groups. So this quote is further illustrating that vulnerable population, there's no evidence to show that vulnerable populations are actually being coerced by family members or physicians, which aligns with my topic sentence and further supports my thesis statement that physician-assisted suicide should be legalized. And of course I have my citation there. Now the next step is I'm going to analyze my evidence For example, and of course in your analysis you're explaining what the evidence is showing. So I have here, most critics who argue that vulnerable populations are at risk for coercion do so from an emotional or opinionated standpoint, not from a logical or evidence-based standpoint. In fact, there are guidelines in place to prevent such coercion, including, and then I can go on to further expand on what those guidelines are and develop that point. Next, I'm going to discuss my point, so I might say something like, as such, physician-assisted suicide should be legalized across the 50 states because patients should be able to follow through with their decision once their decision is made. And then I can develop that discussion. So I'm basically bringing this point back to my thesis statement to show how it's supporting my thesis. So now we have some words or phrases that you can use for argument. So you might say something like, critics may argue that blah blah blah, but etc., and you counter it. You might say, some have opposed this position, claiming that da da da, however, and then you counter it. You might also say, even though people believe da da da, in actuality, and then you explain your counter to the position, to their position. Another way to do it is, although one point can be made that da da da, it doesn't consider, so you're basically showing a point that the opposition has not considered, which makes their own position weak. Now, when you are writing your counter argument in your essay, let's go back to the essay structure. So you can have your counter argument as your first body paragraph. You can have your counter argument as your last body paragraph, or you can set up each one of your body paragraphs as a counter argument. There is no limit to this. If you set up your each body paragraph as a counter argument, it actually strengthens your paper because it shows that you've thoroughly thought about your topic and you have considered really considered all different points that the opposition might come at you with, and then you've thought about how you can go against that and what the weaknesses are in their points. So setting up each one of your body paragraphs as a counter argument helps to strengthen your argument a lot. But if you want to just have one counter argument paragraph, that's totally fine. It can work as the first body paragraph or your last body paragraph, depending on how your ideas are flowing. So basically, you just choose whatever works for your paper. But again, I can't emphasize this enough. The most important, or actually one of the most important things that you need to do is you need to make sure you explain why the opposition's point is not a valid point. That's the step that a lot of students forget to do, and that creates confusion in your paper because you just end up arguing for the opposition. So you absolutely need to explain why their point is not valid so that you're still arguing for your own thesis. And those are the basics of writing a persuasive essay, and more specifically, writing a counter argument.